Imagine a world where death walks among the living, striking down the young and the old, the rich and the poor, without warning. This is not a nightmare or a horror movie. It's a glimpse into the 14th century during the time of the Black Death. The Black Death, or the Great Plague as it was known then, was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. It swept through Europe, North Africa, and Asia, killing millions of people and leaving a trail of devastation that would shape the course of human civilization for centuries to come. The Black Death began its journey in the remote regions of Central Asia, possibly in the area that is now Kazakhstan. From there, it spread along the trade routes that connected the East and the West. By 1347, it had reached the Mediterranean ports, and from there, it quickly spread across Europe. The first recorded outbreak in Europe was in the Sicilian port of Messina in October 1347. Within a few months, it had reached France, Spain, and England. By 1348, it had spread to Germany, and by 1350, it had reached Scandinavia and even Iceland. The symptoms of the Black Death were terrifying. Victims would suddenly develop high fevers, chills, and aches. They would then begin to develop painful, swollen lymph nodes known as buboes, which were black and oozing with blood and pus. These buboes gave the disease its name, the Black Death. Some victims would also develop a form of the disease that affected their lungs, causing them to cough up blood and experience difficulty breathing. This pneumonic form of the plague was even more deadly, as it could be transmitted through the air. The death toll was staggering. Historians estimate that the Black Death killed between 30% to 60% of Europe's population, amounting to millions of deaths. In some cities, the mortality rate was even higher. For example, in Florence, Italy, it is estimated that up to 70% of the population died. The impact on society was profound. Entire families were wiped out, leaving orphans and widows struggling to survive. Fields were left untended, and crops rotted in the fields. Trade and commerce came to a halt, and the economy was in shambles. The clergy, who were supposed to provide comfort and guidance during this time, were not spared. In some places, up to 1/3 of the clergy died. This was particularly true in the city of Avignon, where the Pope resided. The high mortality rate among the clergy was partly due to their close contact with the sick and dying, as they performed last rites and buried the dead. In England, the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Stratford, died in August 1348, followed by his appointed successor and the next appointee, all within a year. Despite these tragic losses, the higher-ranking clergy, such as bishops, generally had a higher survival rate compared to the lower-ranking clergy. Government officials, who were essential for maintaining order and stability, also suffered significant losses. In Siena, Italy, 4 out of the 9 members of the governing oligarchy died. In France, 1/3 of the royal notaries perished. In Bristol, England, 15 out of the 52 members of the town council died. The loss of these officials contributed to the chaos and disorder that gripped many communities. Tax collection, an already difficult task, became nearly impossible. Philip VI of France, for example, was unable to collect more than a fraction of the taxes granted to him by the estates in the winter of 1347-48. The Black Death also brought out the worst in human behavior. As the plague spread, people began to engage in lawless and debauched activities. Some saw the end of the world approaching and decided to indulge in their darkest desires. According to Thucydides, who wrote about a similar plague in Athens in 430 B.C., people grew bold in the indulgence of pleasure, foreseeing how the rich died in a moment, and those who had nothing immediately inherited their property. They reflected that life and riches were alike transitory, and they resolved to enjoy themselves while they could. This kind of behavior was not limited to ancient times. It was also observed during the Black Death. People who survived the plague often turned to debauchery, believing that life was too short to worry about the consequences of their actions. One of the most frightening aspects of the Black Death was the lack of understanding of its cause. People of the 14th century had no concept of bacteria or viruses. They did not know that the plague was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which was carried by fleas and rats. Instead, they attributed the plague to a variety of causes, many of which were supernatural. Some believed that the plague was a punishment from God for the sins of humanity. Others blamed the planets, believing that a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the 40th degree of Aquarius had caused the disease. Still, others believed that the plague was caused by foul air or miasmas that came from swamps, stagnant water, or even the breath of the sick. The lack of understanding about the cause of the plague led to many ineffective and sometimes harmful attempts to prevent and treat the disease. People burned aromatic substances to purify the air, thinking that this would drive away the bad air that was believed to cause the plague. Some doctors prescribed bloodletting, purgatives, and enemas, all of which did more harm than good. Others recommended avoiding contact with the sick and staying indoors, which was one of the few effective measures available at the time. The most extreme response to the plague was the rise of the flagellants, a religious movement that advocated public self-flagellation as a way to atone for the sins of humanity. The flagellants believed that the plague was a sign of God's anger, and that only through extreme penance could they earn his forgiveness. They would march through the streets, barefoot and in sackcloth, beating themselves with whips and whipping each other. These processions often lasted for days, and were attended by thousands of people. While the flagellants' motives were sincere, their actions often spread the disease even further, as they traveled from town to town and came into close contact with large groups of people. Eventually, the church and secular authorities had to intervene and ban these processions to prevent the further spread of the plague. Despite the lack of scientific knowledge about the plague, some individuals made important observations that would later contribute to our understanding of the disease. For example, the Italian physician Gentile da Foligno noted that the plague seemed to be transmitted through the air. He wrote that poisonous material is communicated by means of air breathed out and in. While he did not understand the role of microorganisms in disease transmission, his observations were an important step towards the development of the germ theory of disease. The Black Death had a profound impact on medieval society. The loss of so many people, especially those in positions of power, led to a breakdown in social and economic structures. The shortage of labor led to an increase in wages and a decrease in the power of the feudal lords. Serfs, who were previously bound to the land, now had the opportunity to move to cities and find better-paying jobs. This shift in the labor market contributed to the decline of the feudal system and the rise of a more modern capitalist economy. The Black Death also had a significant impact on the church. The high mortality rate among the clergy and the failure of the church to provide adequate comfort and guidance during this time led to a loss of faith and trust in the church. Many people began to question the authority of the church and the effectiveness of its teachings. This skepticism would later contribute to the Reformation and the rise of Protestantism. The Black Death also had a lasting impact on art and literature. The fear and despair that accompanied the plague were reflected in the works of many artists and writers of the time.